Well, I want to talk to you this morning about a subject that is not so well known, but I think it fits in perfectly with a prophecy conference when you look at New Testament prophecy that predicts the apostasy that will come in at the end of the age. And I'm a person who likes to know why we're where we are. How did we get to this point? People are aware across the country that something has happened in their church. They can't quite put their finger on it. They don't quite understand it, but something is off. Well, this is a partial answer. And so I want to talk this morning about a statement that's really an oxymoron, Christian Marxism. The introduction of the social gospel into the American church. And again, I don't mean the wider church. I'm talking about straight into the heart of evangelicalism. The American evangelical community has been infiltrated by people who are left-wing ideologues. This explains why you see some of the teachings that have come in, even some of the protests across the country that are financed by people like George Soros. What most of us don't realize is the evangelical leadership, in some cases, has been compromised by forces like this. I grew up basically in Mayberry. I mean, I had an Opie Taylor upbringing. It was idyllic. I had a wonderful childhood. On Sunday mornings, getting ready for church, my mother would help me get ready when I was little, and she would, slick my hair down, and then when she would go get ready, she would put a mesh grape sack over my head to keep my hair in place. And so I would sit in front of the television with this grape sack on my head watching Davy and Goliath. And in those days, as kids, you were taught biblical principles, I mean, there was good theology in Davy and Goliath. And there were boundaries within our society. The schools were basically well-ordered places to learn. But I think today, right now, if we think we're going to return to that, we're not being really realistic. The MAGA, Make America Great thing is a great sentiment, and I appreciate some of the efforts that the new leadership is implementing. But I'm not sure we're going to return to the 1950s and 60s. For longer than most of us can imagine, the old-time religion has been under attack in this country. Not for the last 10 years or 20 years, not even for the last 100 years. It goes back farther than that. What I want to do today, this morning, is to show you that a combination of political ideology with liberal theology has worked hand in glove to change the West. Okay? Western values have been under attack for a very long time. But these twin forces are the ones that have combined to bring us where we are today. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, of course, were German philosophers, friends, who created the system of communism, Marxism, which, if you boil it down, on the surface, it's sold as a communal living system where everybody shares and everybody has equal stuff and everybody gets along in harmony. It was sold that way to Russia. The Russians were tired of the Tsarist system, the corruption. Fidel sold it to the Cubans. Batista, we had to get rid of this guy. We're going to bring in utopia. The problem with communism is at its root, it's an atheistic system. And what works on paper does not work in actual practice. And so the redistribution of wealth becomes a power grab by the elites, by the people who run things. In Russia, it was the Bolsheviks. Do you think Lenin had the best interests of the people at heart? Of course he didn't. They were power-hungry, radical thinkers who made themselves the priority. This is actually also why the kibbutz system in Israel didn't really work long-term in a widespread way, because that kind of system just doesn't work in actual practice. So redistribution of wealth and all those kind of things maybe sounds good on paper. And you've heard the recent thing that we're going to have a universal salary. I research this stuff every day, and I come across things that just blow my mind. I think I can't be surprised anymore. A universal salary so that you just sit at home and do nothing, and the government gives you a check. This stuff doesn't work in actual practice. And so our religion in this country has been under attack for a long time, but so is capitalism. And so when we were embroiled in the Civil War, Marx and Engels were developing this system in Europe. And communism, I believe, is the most destructive political model in human history, responsible for 100 million deaths in the last century. It's a monstrous system. And yet, as I hope you'll see, I think there's documentation that will prove that even in the evangelical church, some of the leadership sort of thinks that this is maybe the way to go. What we're doing is moving incrementally from democracy to socialism to Marxism and a totalitarian system. It's just the way it is. Now, one of the components of this, one of the plot points of this story that's really overlooked is the aid that attacks on religion have provided so that these forces that want to change the West will succeed. Marx and Engels were developing totalitarian political model in Germany. In England, in London, at the same time, 10 contemporaries and friends of Charles Darwin formed a supper club called the X Club. And if you've never heard of the X Club, this is one of the fascinating stories in history. These men marketed evolutionary philosophy to the West. Do you know why they believed in evolution? Because they wanted to. It wasn't about settled observational science. It was about what they thought up here about God and the universe and who they were and why they were here. John Morris of the Institute for Creation Research once said, most people believe in evolution because most people believe in evolution. Thomas Huxley, who was called Darwin's bulldog, he was an aggressive, he was the Carl Sagan or Richard Dawkins of his era. A very aggressive guy, lecturer, which in those days was their social media. These guys got out in front of audiences. And Huxley once came to the States and he looked through a fossil collection at a place in New York. And they took him down to the basement, and he's looking at these boxes of dinosaur fossils that hadn't been put together yet. They're just in boxes, loose. And the guy is actually fitting them together to create a creature that would prop up a theory he had of the evolution of the horse. This wasn't unbiased, objective science. This was philosophy. And wrong philosophy is killing the West. And it started here. One of the men in the X Club, Thomas Archer Hurst, was a mathematician, but his hobby was proving geologically that the Genesis accounts were not accurate. So all of this stuff combined to undermine religion in the West, and they exported it to America. The gentleman on the left, Henry Ward Beecher, in the late 19th century was probably the Billy Graham of his day in terms of fame. He was kind of America's preacher. From his perch in New York City. The problem with Beecher was that he was an outright liberal, liberal theology, a serial philanderer. He was immoral, and yet he was a really powerful speaker, and he could influence people through his words. And Beecher, among other things, became enamored of evolutionary theory, the philosophy of naturalism. And he wrote letters to Herbert Spencer, another member of the X Club. Spencer was a British sociologist and a guy, he actually coined the term survival of the fittest, not Darwin. And it was Spencer's social evolutionary theories that fueled the policies of totalitarians. In other words, survival of the fittest undergirded Hitler's model for the world. Stalin, Mao. But Beecher thought he was a really cool guy. In fact, if you read some of the letters that he wrote to Spencer, it sounds like he was in love with him. And in 1882, he brought Spencer to the States for a lecture tour all across the country, in churches and lecture halls, advancing the theory of evolution. That's where the slide in this country really started. The gentleman on the right, Paul Tillich, who I'll talk about again in a minute because he plays a more significant role. He was one of these liberal Bible scholars who taught that much of the Bible, much of the Hebrew Scriptures is myth. So this was the ground that was being prepared in the United States at that time, and there's an unbroken chain. There was no break, there was no gap, there's no gap theory in the advancement of leftist ideology. And so once Beecher and those guys passed from the scene, their place was taken by men like Harry Emerson Fosdick, another famous preacher in New York City, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. T.T. Shields was a great Baptist preacher in Canada at the time, and he said in the 1930s, Harry Emerson Fosdick was the greatest enemy of the gospel in North America. An enemy of the gospel who cloaked himself in Christianity. He wrote children's books about the Bible that encouraged children to believe the Bible is myth. If you wonder how we got to where we are, this is where it started. Now, moving a little more into the political sphere, there were religious dupes. And by the way, there's a great book called Dupes by a man named Paul Kengor, K-E-N-G-O-R. It's a big book, but it is absolutely illuminating in talking about how the Soviets, from the very beginning, I mean in the 1920s, Lenin and Stalin were plotting how to undermine the West, and specifically America. And they sent their agents here to have influence with different levels of our society, political, religious, media. I think they succeeded. The gentleman here in the middle, Dr. Harry F. Ward, was a Methodist minister. He was the first national chairman of the ACLU. What was a preacher doing being involved in the formation of the American Civil Liberties Union? He wrote a book called The Soviet Spirit. He was a member of the Communist Party USA, and he spoke at events held by the National Council of American-Soviet Friendship. Ward was an example of American leaders who sometimes were brought to the Soviet Union for a customized tour. And very obviously, they didn't show them the starvation and the gulags, the confiscation of private property and all that. They put on a show for them for a week or two and then sent them home to tell Americans how great communism is. Harry F. Ward, a Methodist minister. He is absolutely the spiritual forefather of men like Tony Campolo, Jim Wallace, Shane Claiborne. So, a little definition of terms. What is a liberal and what is a leftist? A liberal, I think, is somebody you can sit down and have a conversation with. There's nothing wrong with talking about worldview and sharing your worldview. Politically, some of you will remember a person like Henry Jackson, the senator, Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson was a liberal that you could engage with. I think he loved his country. But about the time that Ted Kennedy, post-Chappaquiddick, began to build his political career in the U.S. Senate, I think Ted Kennedy, was a catalyst for changing this country politically. And today's Democrat Party, particularly in the Senate, is leftist in its ideology, not liberal. Jack Kennedy was a liberal, but he fought for his country, and he loved this country. A leftist is a person who embraces totalitarian worldview. Socialism, fascism, communism. Those are the people who are our ideological opponents. And their worldview is dangerous, and it's also relentless. They never take a day off. We do. They don't. They have targeted the American church. If you want to know why somebody like Hillary Clinton believes what she believes, you have to look at her backstory. We all have a backstory. We're all formed by something. Hillary Clinton has been a radical leftist for 50 years. Not since her husband became governor of Arkansas or president of the United States. It didn't happen in the last 25 years. It happened 50 years ago. It happened before she was a student at Wellesley. Hillary Clinton, the story goes, as a young person, was as conservative as her father, Hugh Rodham. But what happened to her? What happened to her was the guy on the left in this picture, Don Jones, her spiritual mentor early on. Actually, the youth minister in her Methodist church in the Chicago suburbs in the early 1960s. Among the things, the kinds of teaching that Jones brought to Hillary Clinton's youth group, Hillary Rodham's youth group, were the teachings of Paul Tillich. Okay? So think about this, and I think you can make this connection. If Hillary Rodham was taught that much of the Old Testament is myth, in other words, that chunks of Jewish history, Hebrew history, are myth, then can you understand why, as Secretary of State, she would ram the two-state solution down Israel's throat? She doesn't believe in any biblical title deed to the land. She believes in her leftist ideology that we're going to make things equitable. We're going to make things equivalent over there. Give the Palestinians a state. Carve out Israel's heartland. It makes sense. And it does make sense in human terms. It really does. From a humanist standpoint, look, even a person like Colin Powell, even Condoleezza Rice, you can't appeal to those people from the Bible. If you try to tell them, and I know one prophecy teacher in particular, a famous one, who had an audience with Condoleezza Rice, and he told her one day in the White House, he talked to her in terms of God's covenant with Israel, and that the land belongs to the Jews, I can promise you when he left her office, she rolled her eyes. He's a wacko to people like that. You can't appeal to the Bible with these people. It's not in their makeup. This is one big reason why Hillary Clinton is a radical leftist politician. She's more than a politician. It's who she is. It defines her. And it started with things like this. Today, you need to know that millennials, 18 to 35-year-olds roughly, and I mean evangelical millennials, are being targeted by these forces. Cornel West is a university professor back east. His friends call him Brother Corn. And he cloaks himself in a form of Christianity. Cornel West describes himself as a non-Marxist socialist. So you know what that means, don't you? He's a Marxist. Right? It's doublespeak. He's a hardcore leftist. I heard him speak 2 years ago at the so-called Justice Conference in Chicago. Downtown Chicago in the old Chicago Theater. Beautiful facility. 2,000 millennials in the audience. I sat in the front row. They're all behind me. And when Brother Corn came out to give the keynote, they were almost overcome with emotion. They applauded like mad. And this guy, this is a photo of him there. I struggled to understand some of what he was saying, and in a minute I'll be specific about that. But the guy got up there and he railed against white supremacy, white guilt, white colonialism. I was astonished and not a little unnerved. But the audience ate it up. If you want to know why the protests are going on in this country and why they're shouting down conservatives, this is a big reason why. These are the forces at work. And Cornel West said some of the craziest stuff I've ever heard in my life from a speaker. And he was treated like a rock star. Now, I want to read a couple of quotes for you. I'll put them on the screen. These come from a book by David Horowitz. David Horowitz is a great conservative thinker. He has front page online. Check that out. David Horowitz is a former progressive himself. And he told me once that he changed his political ideology in the 1970s when he realized that his friends, the Black Panthers, were killers. And he's now a great conservative icon. But Horowitz wrote a book called Radicals. And so, listen to this. Now, this is a quote from Cornel West. "I'm a bluesman in the life of the mind and a jazz man in the world of ideas." What? So Horowitz says, like many sentences West writes, this catchy phrase is a substitute for thought that does not make any sense. So what does it mean to be a bluesman in the life of the mind? West's answer? I try to give heart to the intellect by being true to the funk of living. For me, this can only be seen through the lens of the cross and realized in the light of love. It's nonsensical. It's lunacy. And the 2,000 kids in the audience in Chicago thought, this guy is Moses. By the way, when he talks about the cross is a prop for him. It's a prop in his presentations, just like some of the other people I want to mention. West is a leftist. Now, at a break, we walked across the street. They announced that you could go across the street from the theater to a Willow Creek downtown church, which is for millennials. Think about this. Bill and Lynn Hybels, arguably the two most influential evangelical leaders in the world. Okay? Rick Warren, the Hybels, Andy Stanley. Remember that trifecta. You know what kind of pricey real estate this is in downtown Chicago? They have limitless resources to export leftist ideology into the church. That's exactly what they're doing. They invite young people to come over there where they introduce them to more materials and speakers and things like that. This is all orchestrated. It's all coordinated. There is also a push by politicians like Barack Obama to cultivate relationships with young millennial evangelical leaders. In this photo, White House photo op with Christian leaders, two of the men standing, Cameron Strang, who I talked about yesterday, publisher of Relevant magazine. Relevant claims that their digital and print readership is 70 million. And just as a quick aside, if you want to know where the country is going, look at social media. Now, Donald Trump has, I think, 35 million Twitter followers. That is a staggering number. Do you want to guess how many Barack Obama has? 93 million. But in this photo is Cameron Strang grinning because he's standing with Barack Obama. On the other side is Gabe Lyons, who has a group called Q Ideas. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Ostensibly, it's sort of an evangelical think tank, and they have conferences, panel discussions. He brings in all kinds of left-wing thinkers, again, to bring it into the evangelical church. They've infiltrated. Remember what Jude said? They crept in unawares? Absolutely. It's already happened. That is not on the horizon. It's here. Andy Stanley's become very close to the Obamas in a certain sense, preaching a pre-inaugural service in 2013, inviting Michelle Obama to speak at his North Point Church in Atlanta. Look at the crowd. You couldn't get in the door. It's standing room only. I can tell you as a Christian, as a Bible believer, if I were a pastor, the last person on the face of the earth I would invite into my pulpit would be Michelle Obama. Think about that. What is Andy Stanley thinking? These evangelical leaders curry favor with the world. They want to be accepted intellectually by the world. They want a place at the table. Now, you can question their motives. I don't think that all of them have nefarious goals. Some of them, it's sort of like the end justifies the means. They think they're advancing the gospel in some way. But you can't justify this. Then there are what I call evangelical sycophants. Ed Stetzer is a really key change agent in the church. He worked for Lifeway, the Southern Baptist publishing arm, for a long time. Now he has a bigger platform at Wheaton College. He tweeted a few years ago, "I love that President Obama is a family man who loves his wife and girls. Michelle obviously loves and admires him." Oh, please. Just stop the pandering. Now, I'm speculating, but do you know what I think Obama thinks about people like this? They're useful idiots. They're dupes that he can use. One guy had the nerve to challenge Stetzer here on Twitter, and he said yes, and his wife just reminded us that he stands for murdering the unborn. Well, look, I don't know what he's citing, but we do know that the Obamas are as pro-abortion as you can get. You can't go farther than they are on that issue. What does Stetzer answer? And how in the world did you come to that conclusion? Well, see, he's got to cover what the guy just said. He can't look bad to his handlers in the political world. A guy I mentioned yesterday, Russell Moore, Dr. Russell Moore, former Southern Baptist Seminary professor, now unfortunately president of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, with offices in Nashville and Washington. Russell Moore is not your grandfather's Southern Baptist leader. As a young man, he worked for a Democrat congressman from Mississippi. I believe the case can be made that Russell Moore is left-wing. Here he's seated with Obama. Look at the look on Obama's face. One of supremacy. Look at Moore. He's seated lower, grinning like a monkey. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but the bust of Abe Lincoln looks pretty sad. You know? He's bowed his head. He's probably a tear rolling down his cheek. How did the country get to this place? Russell Moore values photo ops with a totalitarian president that wanted to destroy America. And yet he spent all of 2016 demonizing Donald Trump, helped by his friends in the media at the New York Times and Washington Post. If you're a Southern Baptist preacher who is invited by the Post and the Times to write op-eds, you better stop and think about who you're friends with. Moore is also a member of the Evangelical Immigration Table, which has taken more than $1 million from George Soros. Jim Wallace, who I'll talk about in a minute, is also part of the Evangelical Immigration Table. They are open borders, amnesty-type people. I never thought that in my life I would see the evangelical church in the shape it's in. I never saw it coming. I'll admit that to you. I never saw it coming. When I was growing up, we were taught it was the Catholics and the New Agers that were bringing in the New World religion. I never thought it'd be the heart of evangelicalism. Paul Smith's book, New Evangelicalism, make sure you get that book and read it. It'll blow your mind. Ann Voskamp, the writer, tweeted, "How can't we move heaven and earth for the fleeing when heaven moved heaven and earth, moved and came to earth for us? In Jesus' name, please sign welcomerefugees.com." They don't even want to vet people coming from Iraq and Syria. Now, I'm all for being compassionate, and the American church is the most compassionate community in world history. So don't question the compassion of Bible-believing Christians, because you're bearing false witness if you do. But I do not want unvetted groups coming from Iraq and Syria because they're bringing in jihadists. Ann Voskamp, in her flowery moonbeam language, is at best a dupe. But people like her are having great influence with young people in our country. That's why you're seeing changes in the way they see immigration and the way we see immigration. Bill Hybels, again, the power center of the Willow Creek Association, headquartered in Chicago. This is a statement he made a few years ago. "Progressive and centrist evangelicals are one stirring away from a real awakening. He identifies that way. We are interested in the poor, in racial reconciliation, in global poverty and AIDS, in the plight of women in the developing world. What Wallace," meaning Jim Wallace, "has been talking about is coming to fruition." Hybels is telegraphing exactly where it's going. He's telling you what he is. He's talking about Jim Wallace, who I'll mention more in a minute, the head of Sojourners Group in Washington. In a January 13, 2006 radio interview with Interfaith Voices, Wallace was asked, "Are you then calling for the redistribution of wealth in a society?" He replied, absolutely, without any hesitation, that's what the gospel is all about. No, it isn't. Russell Moore will do the same thing. He'll talk about social issues and call them gospel issues. No, that's false. Do you know what the gospel is? The simplicity of the gospel. Read Romans 10, 9 and 10. Preach the word. That's it. It reminds me of a story, a great story. I think illustrates this. Because, they try to confuse things. Racial reconciliation is a gospel issue, or immigration is a gospel issue, or on and on and on. The actor James Cagney was approached once by a young actor who wanted to sit at the feet of the great man and learn from him. This was when method acting was becoming in vogue. Method acting is very complicated. You have to live your character for 18 months and, dress like them and create a whole profile on who this person is, this fictional character. So this young guy comes to Cagney and he knows he's going to tell him something profound. And he said, Mr. Cagney, I just want your advice on acting. Cagney looked at him for a second and he says, well, I get up every morning and I go to the set and I walk onto the set and I say to the director, tell me where to stand. Tell me where to stand. That's it. The simplicity of the gospel is what we need to be telling people. Not that it's about immigration and all this other stuff. It's not. I mentioned Gabe Lyons a minute ago, Q Ideas. This was a Q Ideas gathering in Denver last year. Among the topics is euthanasia compassion or compromising? How is cannabis saving lives? What is gender dysphoria and why does it matter? Are you kidding me? This passes for evangelical thought and topics. Why aren't they teaching the gospel? The reason they're not, the reason they're teaching this, they want to change the political orientation of next generation. They want to change the old-time religion into progressive spirituality. This is a quick pop quiz that I won't test you on. What do you think the answers to these three questions would be? They would answer in the way that a progressive would. They're introducing this kind of topic to millennials. Jen Hatmaker is a real up-and-comer star as a blogger, speaker, and book author. She lives in Austin, Texas, pastors a church with her husband. Jen Hatmaker is a clever writer. She's not my cup of tea, but she's a clever writer, and she uses humor. And because of that skill set, she understands that she is moving in the jet stream of the spirit of the age. Okay? She just came out a few months ago in favor of same-sex marriage. She identifies, I think, still as an evangelical. See, that's very clever. That's a tactic. It's just like Brother Corn talking about the cross. It's a prop for them. She is building her brand as an author, and she understands, instinctively understands, that you gain the widest possible audience today and you make the most money when you travel on the wide road. A few years ago, she wrote an open letter to Trayvon Martin's mother, Trayvon Martin, the young black man that was killed by George Zimmerman. Before Zimmerman's trial, before the trial, she writes this open letter in which she apologizes to Martin's mother for white supremacy, for the racial hatred that rests in all of our hearts as Bible-believing Christians. She apologized and considered George Zimmerman to be a murderer before his trial in which he was acquitted. She tweeted recently, Trump said he doesn't have to release his financials because he won, in quotes. He won in quotes. Well, he did win. Take the quotes away. See, that's propaganda. You have to understand the manipulation of language that these people use. Even by putting it in quotes, she makes his legitimate win illegitimate. Young people read this and they believe it. It goes up here. American presidents have never been above the law, only tyrants. These people will slobber over Barack and Michelle Obama, and they will demonize Donald Trump until the moment he leaves office. Think about that. These are your next generation evangelical leaders. Okay, to Jim Wallace, the Sojourner. He posted on Facebook, the reduction of salvation to an atonement-only gospel is a modern mistake. Wow, what blasphemy. Especially apparent in affluent and powerful countries that would feel easily threatened by a full proclamation of the kingdom of God and all its teachings. In that private gospel, what is lost is Jesus the teacher who shows us the ways of his kingdom. There is no powerful lion, just a sacrificial lamb. No, 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 no. We must reject this kind of ideology with every fiber of our being. These people, our ideological opponents, are on a war footing. And they have been for a long time. And we don't really know what's going on. In Sojourners, Wallace has called the U.S. the great power, the great seducer, the great captor and destroyer of human life, the great master of humanity and history in its totalitarian claims and designs. By the way, this is Soviet-style doublespeak. This is a tactic. You label your opponent what you are. America is totalitarian? Well, we haven't been until now. He made no mention of atrocities in Cambodia, Cuba, or the Soviet Union. In 1979, the journal Mission Tracts published an interview with Wallace in which the activist evangelical expresses hope that more Christians will come to view the world through Marxist eyes. My goodness. Now, here's another example of how theology is brought into this kind of stuff. You've got to undermine religion. And by religion, I mean the faith, the Christian faith. You have to undermine it. If you're undermining political structures, you must also, at the very same time, undermine religious structures. Tony Jones, who used to teach at Fuller, he just decided a few years ago that original sin is a depraved idea. He just decided to jettison the basis for the gospel. Original sin is not real? That's stunning. But can you see how that fast tracks millennial thought, changes it from the gospel to another gospel? By the way, I'm not aware of any major evangelical leader that ever said anything about this publicly. They're all sitting on their hands. They're building their brands. They're maintaining their private ministry. They can't speak out. And Bill Hybels and Lynn Hybels host annually a leadership summit at Willow Creek. And, Colin Powell, Mark Burnett, Bob Goff, Andy Stanley, they'll have other political leaders. It has nothing to do with the gospel. It has nothing to do with Christianity. Come by my table and leave me your email address, and I will send to you an article that I wrote a couple of years ago about the religious manifesto of Lynn Hybels, where she talks about her movement from biblical Christianity to what I call paganism. It is stunning. It will begin to help you understand why the Hybels have moved in the direction they've moved. Churches are now using Marxist imagery to announce study series. Vigilantes rebel against the ordinary, whatever that means. Who knows what that was about? It wasn't about the Bible, I can tell you that. But look at the raised fist. This is Mao, Stalin, It's the same imagery they used in Eastern Europe for 100 years, and it's in the church. Images are important. This gets in people's minds. This was the Justice Conference I attended, which gave a prominent space to the Black Lives Matter people. The lady in the white pants in the middle is Reverend Tracy Blackman. She's a United Church of Christ minister, which of course is the official denomination of Barack Obama. A gentleman, a couple of people down from her in the jacket and yellow shirt, Black Lives Matters t-shirt. Black Lives Matters is a front for the Workers' World Party and Freedom Road Socialist Organization. If young people today had been raised on Davy and Goliath, we would be in a much different place today. Michael Savage said that progressives have long waged a war on religion as part of their Marxist agenda for an atheist socialist state. To get there, they believe they have to tear down and destroy everything that defines Western civilization as it is. Marsha West had a really good quote on Facebook. She said, much of the problem lies in the fact that oodles of lie celebs, low information evangelicals, their leaders, are unapologetically liberal in their worldview, and their teaching reflects that. They are. The majority of evangelical leaders in America today are left-wing. I stand by the statement. Here's another example. Jen Hatmaker is promoting a study, an online study you can do that was written by Cornel West. I heard her speak at a Catalyst conference in Dallas 3 years ago, and she called herself a change agent. The left understands exactly what's going on. I'm not sure we do. I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. This was an interesting experience I had a few years ago. I went to Pulaski Heights United Methodist Church in Little Rock, Arkansas, to hear Brian McLaren speak. Most of you know who McLaren is. He's a major emergent leader, as left-wing as you can get. I also think that McLaren is so smart, he knows exactly what he's doing. Some of these people are deceived themselves. He's a deceiver. So there's a 3-part lecture series. I went on the last night, and so I think, we're going to hear something about spirituality, not biblical Christianity, but spirituality. No, it was a 45-minute diatribe against capitalism. There's like 200 people in this chapel listening to him. And so at one point, he makes, this is the craziest statement I've ever heard in public. He wanted to make capitalism and Marxism equal in people's minds. And so he said, Marxism has traditionally always been bad at production but good at distribution. But capitalism, on the other hand, has always been good at production but bad at distribution. And I looked around the room and I thought, did you hear what he just said? He's either insane or he's lying to you. No. Marxism has always been horrible at both production and distribution. That's why they killed 60 million people. Capitalism has always been brilliant at both production and distribution. America's fed the world for a long time. Is he serious? But he wanted to implant this idea in people's mind, and the incredible thing is people just hear stuff like this, and without using any critical thinking, they believe what they just heard. The takeaway was that as a worldview, capitalism is equal to Marxism and vice versa. That is false. Jerome Corsi wrote in 2012, the class warfare themes Obama articulates in his speeches running for re-election in 2012 come almost word for word from the Saul Alinsky Rules for Radicals playbook. Alinsky, the American communist. Obama, from the start, was raised on Marxist ideology. I say that you can't prove he's Muslim. Seem to be good indications that he was helping them. The Middle East is burning to the ground because of it. But you can prove that he's a totalitarian. That's who he is. But the point I tried to leave yesterday is that even with things going on, even the way the world is, we are not without hope. In fact, I simply believe in being realistic about the world I live in. I don't want to live in a world that I want it to be a certain way. I have to understand that I live where I live. And we live in the time we live in. It's not 1953 and Eisenhower's in the White House. We live in a very different time. But as believers, and believers in the blessed hope, we are going to glory. We know whom we have believed. And so in the midst of things like this, when you see hurricanes and presidents stand up and say we're not a Christian country anymore, and you see people like Hillary Clinton running for president, and you see young people protesting and looting, keep at the forefront of your mind and in your heart that the Lord is coming soon. In Psalm 33, we wait in hope for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. In Him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in His holy name. May your unfailing love be with us, Lord, even as we put our hope in you. And finally, I spoke about the first part of Jude earlier, where he predicted that in the last days, into the church, men and women would creep in by stealth and change the way we think. But the end of his book says, now unto him that is able to keep you from falling and to present you faultless before the presence of his glory with exceeding joy, to the only wise God our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power, both now and forever. Amen. Pay attention to where we are and be realistic and clear-eyed, but keep joy in your heart. Spurgeon said, little children, whatever you do not have, you have a God in whom you may greatly glory. Let the times roll on. They cannot affect our God. Thank you.